So, hi everyone, and welcome to Architecture in the Den with me, Lisa Raynes. And today I'm delighted to welcome Stephen Hodder, Manchester architect extraordinaire. So, hi, Steve.
That's very flattering, Lisa.
I must say, for the first time, I've been really nervous about this interview.
Why?
I don't know. I think I've known you since just about qualifying as just about qualifying as an architect. So when I was at Ian Simpson's, you were in the office next door.
Yeah, that's right. We shared the top floor at Commercial Street, didn't we?
Yeah, so as a trainee architect, you know, kind of like big eyes, just looking around at who was there. It was like, there's Stephen Hodder.
Oh dear.
20 a few years later, and our paths have crossed at various times, as they do in Manchester, because Manchester's very small.
Yeah, I think we first met at a MSA dinner, wasn't it? I think MSA Awards. Um,
Yes.
I think that was probably in my first year as RIBA president when I was having a little bit of a tough time. You'll recall.
Yes, yes. And I joined the council 2015 to 18. When were you president?
Uh, 2013 to 15.
Yeah, so you were president.
So
And
you,
it was really nice to come down to the council and see a fellow Manchester architect.
yeah. Well, you know my view. I think regional representation on council has always been really important to me. But yeah, no, I concluded. Well, I had a year. You have a year following your presidential term as immediate past president, where you're still on the board, or you were then. It's changed now, I gather. But yeah, so 2016 was really the end of my sentence on the RIBA.
Changed? What's it changed to?
Well, it was always discussed when I was president about who was the ultimate authority within the RIBA. And if you remember, we had council, which then was the ultimate authority, and then we had a board. But now it's actually reverted; it's the board. So the council, I gather, is advisory, but the board is now the main decision-making authority within the RIBA. So I understand.
Mm, mm.
And equally then, as president, you were, I was also chair of the board, whereas that's not the case anymore.
Right. So is there still a kind of ex-president role at the RIBA?
I think for the
Like immediate past
yeah,
president.
yeah, yeah. But
Yeah.
I'm not involved with the RIBA anymore. No, I had 7 years of being engaged with the RIBA. As I said to someone not so long ago, I still bear the scars.
So I usually start the podcast by asking our guests to introduce themselves. So about five
Okay,
minutes in, please can you introduce yourself?
of course. Thanks, Lisa. So I'm Stephen Hodder, founding director of Hodder and Partners Architects, and as we discussed, past president of the RIBA. Until recently, I was also chair of the Construction Industry Council. I've concluded that term now as well. And I'm currently Professor of Architecture at the Manchester School of Architecture. I think that captures it, I think.
Very good. And I'm going to like what's the word, fangirl a bit. So you've built a lot of skyscrapers in Manchester, as I've seen recently. So how many skyscrapers have you done in Manchester?
Not that many, actually. I think we've realised four, and there are others in the pipeline. So yeah, more to come, I guess. but I don't like, for somebody who suffers from vertigo, five stories is my sort of vertigo threshold. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Throughout my architectural life, you become pigeonholed, don't you? So we finished our first tall building opposite Oxford Road Station, and suddenly you become an expert or knowledgeable in tall buildings. But yeah, no, when it comes to site inspections, I'm afraid I leave that to others in the practice.
You don't go to the topping out ceremonies.
No.
So what's the tallest one that you've done so far?
I think it was that first one for Student Castle, and as I said, opposite um, Oxford Road Station. We completed another tall building in Stratford High Street in East London. That was 31 stories, but Student Castle was, I think, 39 stories. Yeah, so our tallest will be the project that we're currently doing for Gary Neville, which opposite the town hall, that will be 43 stories.
Cool. Is that the old Booth Street?
Yeah, it's the old police station. Yeah, St Michael's as it's called.
Yeah, the controversial one.
Yeah, less controversial since we've been involved.
Of course. Oh dear. I don't It's one of those things, as an architect, people always say to me, what's the tallest thing you've ever done? So I've just thought I'd throw that one at you.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, isn't it? Because with limited land supply, I mean, Manchester as a city council are not frightened of tall buildings, but yeah, I mean, I think it's quite interesting because we're working nationally now. We have a 41-story tower which is going to planning next month in Sheffield, and then we have a similar student accommodation in Bristol. I think that's 28 stories. But it's interesting, isn't it, how, as I said, with limited land supply, that a lot of local authorities are now supporting tall buildings. Yeah.
I just want to take you back a bit and kind of just look back on your career. Well, actually, I think a lot of people who listen to this podcast are kind of students, people getting into architecture. So I kind of want to look back and just why did you study architecture in the first place?
Yeah, I often sort of look back and think about that. I, when I was 11, my parents bought a new house uh, in Nottingham, and I met the architect, and it wasn't necessarily inspirational to me, but I mean that certainly aroused a curiosity. But then, rather typically, I guess, at school. I was, my education was very balanced between the sciences and art. Nobody from my school had ever become an architect. And when I look back, I don't think the advice was terribly rehearsed. It was terrible. I don't think the careers advice was not terribly good. But I think that was largely cemented in sixth form, when through my father, I had a work experience in a small practice in Nottingham, and so that really cemented really what I wanted to do. But I've wanted to be an architect since I was 11 years old. But you go into School of Architecture, don't you? I mean, I was a very young 18-year-old, and I went into a School of Architecture really not knowing what architecture was all about.
Yeah, and I think it's like learning to drive. You kind of only really know how to learn how to drive once you've got your license.
I remember when I came to Manchester and had my interviews in what was the School of Architecture at the university, and of course my work experience. I had been obviously under the guidance of one of the architects there, had been detailing a garage with, making sure the DPC was 150 millimeters above ground level, And I remember having the interview with two people, Mike Maidens and Dougie McKay, talking about the DPC, that was what architecture was about, Yeah, it was, I think.
Parents do. What did your mum and dad do for a living?
Well, my father was in local government. My father became chief executive of what was Broxton Borough Council, which is essentially the west side of Nottingham. So he was always in the public sector, but always took great interest in in me in practice. He always used to call me on a Sunday evening, and we would have a download for about an hour about the trials and tribulations of practice, because I'd only been qualified a year when I set up in practice on my own.
Right.
Sort of a huge learning curve, and he was a good he was a good listener, and whilst he had no experience of the private sector, he was a really good mentor for me, always offering sound advice. And my mother supported my father. She was of that generation, where her life was just to support my dad in public office, but he was very instrumental in me starting in practice. I'd been with Building Design Partnership for a couple of years, and
So is that where you did your kind of part threes?
yes, for 2 years, yeah. And then he was very friendly with the chief executive of the Greater Nottingham Cooperative Society, and they were going through rationalising their land ownership, and there was a huge piece of land in a place called Towton in Nottingham, and I remember getting a phone call from that chief executive saying, would I go and see him? So I took a day off from practice from BDP, and I went to see him in his offices in Nottingham, and he said, would you like to do the project? And he said, and I said, well, I'm not sure whether Building Design Partnership would be interested. He said, no, would you like to do the project? And on the back of that, I approached a colleague who had been in final year with me, but was also at BDP, and we set up together on the back of that project, which was just really a feasibility, and yeah, it's so with the drawing boards that we had as students, and I bought a second-hand golf ball typewriter. You probably can't remember what a golf ball typewriter was, but we had a letterhead designed, and we set up in practice, and incredibly naive. And
so what year was that?
1983. So I've been in practice 40 years this year.
Right. Blimey. With typewriters. I mean, it's crazy to think back what we could do without computers and the internet.
Well, I was actually thinking, Lisa, about this podcast beforehand, and really my life in architecture has seen such a huge change, from whether it be the drawing board to computer design, and now building information modeling, and even the way in which we procure projects has just changed so much. I'm sure in any generation, people see a shift, but I think the shift in our profession over the last 40 years has been seismic, hasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely crazy. Sorry, my dogs are going a bit ballistic. I'm working from home, which is where my office is, and anytime people go past the front door, the dogs just go a bit crazy. Whereas you're facing the canal, aren't you?
Yeah, we bought this 12 years ago. We were looking to invest, and um, we stumbled across. We were working for a client who developed these apartments. So we have the commercial unit on the ground floor, and it had planning permission for a bar restaurant, but nobody had ever taken it. And we came in as a shell of a space, and it fronts onto the Bridgewater Canal. And we just thought, wow, what an amazing space. So we bought it, and it's been really good for us, actually. It's a wonderful environment to be in. Clients love coming in. We bought the car park as well because we're in just slightly out in Castlefield. So no, we fitted it out, and it's sits in our pension fund, and it's been good for us, really good.
Yeah, because we've got a narrowboat. So the last time we came in through Manchester.
How did you come past on the?
Yeah. I was like, oh.
Yeah.
I might have recorded it. I don't know. If I can find it, I could splice it into this. Oh, that'd be a bit clever. That might be a bit too clever for me to splice it into the YouTube. Way virtually. Yeah. So I mean, that was going to be one of my questions, actually. Have you got involved in any development projects yourself?
No, no. Only that. I mean, we we developed our own house in South Manchester in Hale. We have a place in Grasmere, if you can call that a development. And this, I don't have the time. My life is absolutely committed to what I do and my teaching. So that said, I'd like to think that I have a commercial head on my shoulders, and when it comes to advising developers, I can speak their language, which I think is important. But no, I've never ventured into that. Don't have time.
Or potentially taking on the liability of it as well.
Yeah. Money and sort of liability in practice can be quite significant at times, can't it? Particularly today.
So how's your office structured at the moment? How many staff have you got? How many offices?
We only have this office now. After the Sterling Prize, I set up an office in London on the back of a large competition that we won there. And again, I mean, I didn't have really the business acumen to really think about how that office might work. And ultimately, I closed that office. It just simply wasn't working, and there was too much pressure on the young architects there, and I was sort of traveling between Manchester and London, trying to control both offices, which just didn't work. We've always kept the practice quite, in terms of its size, it's quite modest. There's just 20 or so people here, largely because I like to be involved in every project. A lot of my contemporaries, I see them, with very large practices, and I just sometimes wonder how you maintain that quality, and that sort of consistency. So I like to touch every project. I'm not, I'm involved in varying degrees. Some projects I'm, very, very closely involved with, others less so. We have the practices owned by myself and Claire, my wife. We're a husband and wife team. And then we have three other directors, younger directors, who, will hopefully take the practice on when I choose to, if I ever do retire. I can't ever imagine that happening. And then the teams are made up from, depending on the scale of the project, the teams are then made up from a mix of senior architects. I've always the age profile of the practice is quite young. I enjoy working with, so I get particularly final year students joining the practice. They bring huge energy to the practice, and I love working with them. And we have a sort of core of people that have been with me for a long time, and then we have the sort of fluffy bits around the edge of people who come and go, and young architects who continue their education with the practice when they leave School of Architecture. So something like St Michael's, for example, we will have 9 architects working on it. I was very much involved at the outset. Claire, Claire's very much a working architect, but she's very good at delivery, and she runs the business as well. And then we have 2, because the building's split into 2 phases. We have an associate director leading on each phase, with then a sort of mix of architects and architectural assistants in support. Very simple structure.
So, and what about office support staff? Do you have practice managers, or?
We just have we have one. We used to have 2, and that's been very much dependent on the size of practice. But we just have one office manager who also happens to be my executive assistant as well, and that's all that we have. It's quite lean in that regard.
I thought it's always interesting to see how people set up their businesses. So just looking back, what's been the biggest challenge for you? Let me say recently. What's your biggest challenge recently?
Well, I think as a practice, it's all about constant change, isn't it? Yes, you can look back over the history of the practice, or you can look at most recently. And most recently, we've all had to deal with the pandemic, working remotely, which I found really quite challenging because I'm so hands-on. Trying to have design reviews and workshops via screen was just, I found so difficult. I'm somebody who likes to sit down at a table with my pencil and sketch. So that was a big challenge for us. And frankly, on April the 12th, wasn't it, when we were allowed to, after the 3rd lockdown, we were allowed to resume. I mean, everybody rushed back here. The studio culture is hugely important to me. So that was probably, and I think also probably again brought on by the pandemic is managing the economic cycles, in practice. I find that really quite challenging. I mean, I've sort of worked through 4 recessions, and it's one of the most frustrating things, when you're building a team and suddenly work stops, and then you have to lose part of the team.
How do you manage that? Do you kind of work across different sectors to maintain projects?
In theory, yes, but again, I find that another frustrating part of practice, if I was being frank. Because you were talking about tall buildings earlier. It becomes very easy to for practices to be pigeonholed. So we as a practice, our workload has tended to vary depending on how active particular sectors are. So obviously, city centre residential. Suddenly, we were doing nationally huge amounts of inner city residential built to rent. Prior to that, we became known for doing commercial development, and we've delivered a number of commercial. Before that, leisure centres, sports facilities. When I started out in practice, because we started out in Lytham, Lytham St Anne's, we became known for doing restoration on seaside piers. And trying to break into new sectors, I find really, really challenging. there are sectors that I know that we could have made a good contribution. So the first major project that I think became known for
Was
was
this swimming pool in Colne, wasn't it?
absolutely, yeah, yeah. And we'd never designed a swimming pool before. Suddenly, we were designing swimming pools in Grange over Sands and the West Midlands and in London. And today, and it was an anonymous competition as well. Today, I'm not sure that a young practice would be selected for something like that, because inevitably when you're filling out, a PQQ is, well, how many swimming pools have you delivered in the last 3 years, and it's very difficult to break into new sectors, I find. We
I
would
think that
love.
was definitely when I set up, it was one of the issues that I had was breaking into new sectors.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah,
mean,
and you'd spend, all your resources trying to do competitions and get on frameworks and all the rest of it. And yeah, it put me right off.
well, I must say our practice. I mean, we've leapt forward when we. I can pinpoint moments in the development of the practice when we've won a competition. So St Catherine's College, Oxford. That was a competition. Would we have been able to? Would we be able to now to break into the world of the Oxford colleges? I doubt it. But it was a competition that we won. The National Wildflower Centre was a competition that we won. Again, a visitor centre. Most recently, the Welcome Building at RHS Garden Bridgewater. Again, that was a competition that we won. So I'm a supporter of the competition system because that's always seen as, in terms of architecture, seen as developed, but it's also enabled us to move into new sectors. Because of, I mean, we don't sit on any framework, so I don't think we would ever get any schools. I would love to design a school, but we wouldn't. I don't think we'd be given that opportunity now.
Would
If
you,
you,
would you ever work overseas, or do you work overseas?
we don't. We did briefly. I had a client who had some land holdings in Pakistan, and we worked over there for a while. But no, we've never broken into an international market. I mean, when if you cast your mind back when we did the Cube Gallery on Portland Street, I thought that might open up an avenue in the design of cultural projects, but it didn't. You know,
What happened to the Cube Gallery on Portland Street?
I know.
Such a shame. That was the RIBA base for a while.
Well, it was funded by the art. I mean, it was funded by the Arts Council, and once the funding was withdrawn, it just didn't become sustainable. But I mean, as a venue for the debate and exchange of, I mean, the intention always was to try and engage with the public, in the importance of architecture, and it did that for a while, didn't it? With some wonderful exhibitions. Graham Russell, spearheading that was tremendous. And we had our office on the top floor. So it was wonderful to be able to take would-be clients downstairs and show them, what we'd done. Quite apart from it being obviously a former Grade 2 listed cotton warehouse. So in terms of any heritage work, again, we could use that as as an exemplar of what we did, but of what we could do. But yeah, no more.
Yeah, definitely a loss to Manchester. So what would you say is what you're most proud of in your career so far? So far, she says. What's left?
Apart from sustaining a practice for 40 years.
Would you say that's that's the proudest moment?
Yeah. But well, by way of architecture, there's so many moments, aren't there? You mentioned Colne Swimming Pool. winning the first Sterling Prize for the Centenary Building at Salford University. My work at St Catherine's College and engaging with the work, of the great Danish architect Arne Jacobsen and the Jacobsen Foundation. But most recently, the RHS project has just been the most wonderful project to work on. I mean, it against the background of larger and larger and larger projects. For me, it was sort of reacquainting ourselves with everything that we do as a practice of crafting a building, an incredibly visionary client, wonderful contractor, BAM. I can't speak highly enough of them. So it was a true collaborative effort, and I think a client that, in terms of pushing the carbon agenda as well, it really got us thinking a great deal, and probably the most sustainable building that we've delivered as a practice. So that's and remarkably 17 awards, and it's just incredible. It's incredible. And the feedback that we've had, and for the people who use the building as well in Salford, I mean, in the first year they were predicting that it would probably have 100,000 visitors. There were 1 million visitors passed through the door in the first year. So in terms of public benefit, not just the building, the gardens as well. It's been a wonderful project to work on.
Amazing. Well, thanks for sharing that. So last question would be, what advice would you give to an architect setting out in practice?
Oh, that's a difficult one. Because in a way, I set up in practice with my first business partner. It was, as I said earlier, really with great naivety, not really understand. Schools of architecture don't really prepare you for practice, and the whole aspect of business. Probably, this may sound contradictory, because in a way, I've been so lucky with some of the breaks we've had in practice. And I am by nature an ambitious person, but I would probably just advise a young architect to just take your time, think long and hard about what sort of practice you want. And I mean, when I look back, and I mean, yes, we were propelled to set up the London office because of the competition that we won there, but really we weren't ready for that, and I certainly didn't have the skill set to understand the implications of that. And probably, well, now, most definitely now, I would do things a lot differently, So that's probably the best advice I would give is just. To me, I just wanted to go into practice. My ambitions insatiable, and I would just say to people to just slow down. The professional life is a long one, and sometimes you've got to make those mistakes, as part of the learning process. But equally, I think when I reflect, there are probably some mistakes that we've made as a practice that could have been avoided had I taken my time, thought a little bit more about it, thought a little bit more about the construct of practice. For me, it was all about architecture, and I was very, very blinkered. It's probably, and I some of those early projects, yes, we'd win awards for. But commercially, they were disastrous. We would lose money. And in fact, it's really since I started practicing with Claire in 2004, when our first, when Oliver was born, our first, he's 19 now, so I can't say he's a boy. she transformed the practice. Made, in terms of, I don't think we've lost direction. Well, we haven't lost direction, but she's made the practice work commercially, and brought a real stability and a much more structured way to the way in which you go about practice. And so I think that's the sort of advice that I would give. Take your time, think about your business model, but always recognise the importance of what we do as architects. I always say that second best is not good enough in architecture because it impacts on everybody. The way we live, the way we work, we walk amongst it, and it's been my passion. So never lose sight of that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for coming on my little podcast. It's been an honour to have you.
Hardly. Thanks for inviting me. It's just nice to have a chat with you.
And on that note, I'm going to stop. So if anyone listening wants to have a look at Stephen's work, I'll put the links in the website, sorry, on the description, and it's not very hard to find you on the internet. So thanks, Stephen, for coming along.
Pleasure. Thanks, Lisa.